And it's Ken Kraetzer for Sons of the American Legion Radio. We're in Manhattan today at the NYU Langone Concussion Center. Have a chance to talk with Dr. Stephen Flanagan, co-director of NYU's Concussion Center here at Langone. And Dr. Flanagan, great to visit with you here at Langone.
Glad to be here with you.
Pleasure. Now, maybe if you would, tell us a little bit about the Langone Concussion Center, some of its history and some of the service that you provide.
So at NYU Langone, we have a concussion center that's actually fairly unique because it's co-run by a number of different departments. My own department, which is rehabilitation medicine, sports orthopedics, and neurology. But we bring in all of the talent that NYU has to bear. So we bring in radiology, psychiatry, otolaryngology, which is ear, nose, and throat for everybody else, endocrinology. So we bring in a lot of folks together to make sure that who's ever coming in with a concussion can get all of the treatment they need from anybody that can provide it. So it's fairly unique.
Very good. And Dr. Flanagan, you've got a long career in this field. Tell us a little bit about some of the steps and some of the kind of patient care that you've provided over the years.
So in my own specialty in physical medicine and rehabilitation, I have a subspecialty in brain injury medicine, which includes anything you can imagine that goes wrong with the brain and needs rehabilitation. That's what I do, and certainly that includes concussions. So I've been doing this for more years than I'd like to admit, probably between 25 and 30. I started when I had hair. I don't have any more, but it's really what I love to do. And the nice thing is that we see a lot of folks with a brain injury or brain disease, and many times we're getting these folks back to doing the things that they really enjoy doing. So that's what we do, work together with a team of professionals, physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, psychologists, our medical colleagues in different specialties, and we get folks up doing the things that are important for them.
Very good. Well, at Sons of the American Legion Radio, we have the great pleasure and honor to work with members of the military. We also do a lot with college sports and a variety of sports. And you were just mentioning that you see similarities between soldier injuries and athletic injuries, that often they're from similar sources.
So as it turns out, we think of our military men and women getting concussions through blast injury, and for sure that occurs. But the majority of folks in the military who have concussion are getting concussions for the same reason the civilian population are getting concussions: motor vehicle collisions, sports injuries, falls, just being hit. For sure, they're getting injured through blast injuries, there's no doubt about it, but the vast majority, the same as everybody else in the civilian world.
Very good. I know we sat in on a seminar that the NFL and the U.S. Army did at West Point about 5 years ago, and one of the soldiers explained that if you were near an IED going off or other kind of shell, that if you didn't have a physical injury, that you may very well have a concussion. Why is that? Why would that be such a cause of concussions?
So when you're exposed to a blast, there are different phases, but it's the force of the blast that basically hits the body, the brain, which has the consistency of formed jello in the natural state, will shake inside of the skull, and it's that shaking that actually causes the concussion. So for sure, if you're exposed to a blast and your body is rocked and your head is shaking, a good possibility that indeed you may have gotten a concussion.
Very good. Now, obviously, we have the fall sports seasons starting up. Football and also soccer have been noted for having higher rates of concussions and other sports. What are some of the things in sports that people should watch out for as causes of concussions?
So a concussion will occur, again, as I said before, when the brain, which has the consistency of formed jello, it's very soft, shakes inside of the skull. And it's that shaking and the impact of the brain on the skull, and also the stretching and the compression of all of the nerve cells that occur as the brain is shaking. That's what causes the concussion. And when someone has a concussion, there's typically a period of time where there's some confusion or you just feel dazed. and then that can lead to other problems later on, problems with vision and balance and things along those lines. If you're exposed to a blast or a blow to the body or a blow to the head or a fall, and there's a period of being dazed and confused, good chances are you had a concussion.
Right, yes, and now obviously we hear a lot about concussion protocol that's been developed. The NFL has been a great a leader on that. And what are some of the elements to that concussion protocol that someone should be watching out for? Because as you said, you could have concussion from a fall at home or from a minor car accident. What are some of the symptoms to look for?
So when someone has a concussion, as I said, there's going to be likely some alteration in their mental state, some confusion or just feeling dazed and confused. There may be loss of memory for a short period of time, but certainly those are the things you're going to be looking for. And for sure, if someone's had a concussion, and particularly if they're playing sports, you've got to take that person out of the game. Sending somebody back into play or into a dangerous situation, if they've had a concussion, increases the likelihood that they'll get another one. If you think about it, your thinking's a little bit slower, your reflexes are going to be a little bit slower. You're setting yourself up for another concussion. And what I like to say is that one concussion is bad, two is worse, particularly if they occur close together. So if you see someone or if you think someone's had a concussion, get them out of play. When in doubt, send them out.
Very good. And when a patient comes in who's got a concussion that they suspected or has been diagnosed, what does a treatment look like for a patient?
So the treatment for a concussion really varies depending on what the symptoms that a patient may present with. In our world, we like to say if you've seen one concussion, you've seen one concussion, because you can have a whole myriad of symptoms and problems. Headache is a big one, so you've got to treat that, and there are lots of different types of headaches. Folks will come in with visual problems. They may need vision therapy, and so that's a specialization within the world of ophthalmology and occupational therapy, for instance. There may be balance problems. There may be problems with controlling emotions or being able to think as quickly as you do. Psychology for supportive therapy, as well as what we call cognitive therapy or thinking therapy. By and large, there are a whole host of symptoms that go along with concussion, and it really is important to make sure that you're seeing a physician or a healthcare provider who understands the problems that can arise from concussion, and then has the availability or the resources to send you to the right folks who can provide that treatment. That's really the best thing. Vast majority of folks with concussion do get better within a fairly short period of time, but it's always best to see a concussion specialist, get the care that you need, and that will set you on the right track.
Very good. Well, I was talking with a doctor up in Westchester who advised a lot of high school students, and said that it can affect studying and also take as much as a year to fully recover. How long do you tend to see the full recovery period being?
So full recovery after concussion is actually a little hard to define. There's symptomatic recovery when folks feel they're perfectly okay. But even when you're feeling okay, sometimes there's a little bit more healing that the brain has to go through. So it can be symptoms can last for a few days. In a small majority of cases, they may go out to a year or longer. There are some folks who really do develop chronic problems. And we have to look at why they may develop chronic problems and make sure that we're treating the whole patient. The other thing with concussion is that when you get hit and your brain shakes, there could also be an injury to the cervical spine or the neck area, and that can mimic many of the signs and symptoms of concussion. Which again, it's why it's so important to go to somebody who understands everything that can go wrong when you get hit and have concussion symptoms, and making sure that you're getting the care that you need directed at the problems that are really causing your symptoms.
And a couple of years ago, I was watching an NYU panel seminar, and the topic came up of women and concussions. And the comment was made that women, in some cases, are more susceptible to concussions. Tell us a little bit about that.
So we think that women are more likely to suffer the ill effects of concussion because their necks are not as strong as men. So if you think again that the concussion occurs because the brain is shaking inside of the skull, if your neck musculature is not as strong, it's more likely that your brain is going to be shaking a little bit more. Women also tend to be a little bit more open about their symptoms, so they complain a little bit more, or they just simply are more in tune with their symptoms. We're not really quite sure which. But concussion in men and women are a little bit different, and they need to be addressed slightly differently.
Very good. Any thoughts on avoiding a reoccurrence? Does someone who's had a concussion have to be more careful than someone who hasn't?
So I like to say, again, one concussion is bad, two is worse, three is worse still. So you never want to have any concussion. And, having lots of concussion over the course of time can lead to more problems, to be sure. I think the most important thing is particularly when we're talking about sports, is if you have a concussion, you really can't go back into play or even practice until you are completely without symptoms. And then there's a gradual return of activity, and you're not back into play until you are physically active and without symptoms. That is key, and it's this gradual return to play that's really critical. Going back to play, to sports, or any activity that is at risk for causing a concussion is bad if you still have symptoms, because you're much more likely to injure yourself. 2 concussions a day or 2 apart is really bad. 2 concussions, a decade apart, far less serious.
Yeah, it's very, very important for people to know that. Tell us a little bit about the research in the field. Obviously, the studies of NFL players and others have been going on. The military is watching concussion impact, any possible impact on PTSD, long-term, other long-term debilitating diseases and injuries. Where's the research going in the field?
So there's a lot of research in concussion, and I think a lot of the research is really trying to determine, A, what are the biomarkers of concussion, because right now concussion is a diagnosis that's made clinically, meaning there's no test that you can do that will confirm a concussion. It is just the story that makes sense and your physical exam findings that all come together. But there's not a blood test or a CT scan or an MRI scan that will confirm a concussion. Much of the research that we're doing here at NYU Langone in our Concussion Center is focusing on radiology studies using advanced MR technologies to image the brain, and actually looking not just at the structure of the brain but the physiology of the brain using MRI technology. Pretty neat stuff. Why is it that some people with concussion take a longer time to get better? And we're looking at different MR technologies to find out why. We're also very involved in studying what happens to vision after concussion. If you think of all of the tracts in the brain, which are sort of the nerve cells that act as like telephone communication wires, 50% of them in the brain have something to do with vision and the movement of their eyes. So we think that looking at what happens to the visual system gives us a clue of what's happening with concussion, and also potentially a means of diagnosing it a little bit more objectively than what we have right now. There are a lot of folks also at NYU Langone looking at the connection between PTSD and concussion, because those symptoms overlap, and really how do you separate them out, and what does it mean when you have both PTSD or some other psychiatric disorder and concussion? How do they interact, and how best to treat them? So we're looking at all of those things at NYU Langone, and I think that is research that's occurring also throughout the country.
And I know there's quite a bit of information about your practice here at NYU Langone, the Concussion Center, and any other? Is there a thought you have about when a patient could really utilize your service and that of the operation here?
So I think anyone who's had a concussion is probably worthwhile to touch base with a clinician who understands what a concussion is all about. Oftentimes there's misinformation also throughout the in the internet or even on the media that gets folks a little bit more concerned about concussion than perhaps they ought to be, because the vast majority do get better. But that said, I would say that if you have a concussion, It's good to get good information from a healthcare practitioner who understands what concussion's about, and that'll just set you on the right path.
Very good. Dr. Stephen Flanagan, thank you so much for your time today and all the experience and perspective that you've offered today on concussion awareness and treatment. And again, you're the co-director of NYU Langone's Concussion Center here right in the middle of Manhattan on 38th Street. Great to visit with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming in and talking with me. Glad to do it.
Our pleasure. This is Ken Kraetzer for Sons of the American Legion Radio and RallyPoint.com in New York City.